Let us begin this module by discussing about the Milton Friedman and his contributions. Milton Friedman is the most influential economist of the last 50 years and perhaps with John Maynard Keynes the most influential of the entire 20th century. His theories and research continues to shape public policy debates even today. One of the Friedman's most influential and revolutionary theories was his challenge to the traditional Keynesian consumption function, which includes simple after-tax income as a variable in the consumption. Friedman countered, however, that those who consume today take future taxes, price increases, salary increases and other factors into account. He distinguished between permanent income and transitory income as affecting the consumption pattern. This is summarized in his permanent income hypothesis. More specifically, this counters that people consume based off of their overall estimation of future income as well as opposed to only the current after-tax income. Friedman and Kuznets has written the decomposition of income into permanent income and transitory income in early 1940s in the paper titled Income from Independent Professional Practices, but did not publish it. Milton Friedman's PI hypothesis generated from the basic fact that individuals would wish to smooth consumption and will not allow it to fluctuate with short-run fluctuations in income. In fact, the model was developed to explain the important empirical facts in a unified framework. For example, it was developed to answer the questions such as why is income more volatile than consumption and why is the long run marginal propensity to consume out of the income greater than the marginal propensity to consume in the short run. Friedman hypothesized that individuals have a longer term view of the income from which they base their consumption, perhaps a notion of lifetime wealth or a notion of wealth over long time period. The basic hypothesis posted is that out of a permanent income in each period, individuals consume a fraction of it and hence the average propensity to consume would be equals to the marginal propensity to consume. There are large number of factors that influence the propensities, such as the interest rates and the variables that changes the taste or those that reflect uncertainty. The two characters in PIH theory are permanent and transitory income and consumption. The magnitudes termed permanent income and permanent consumption that plays such a critical role in the theoretical analysis cannot be observed directly for any individual consumer unit. Only the actual receipts and expenditures are observed during some finite period, supplemented with some statements regarding the future expectations. The theoretical constructs of the theory usually have magnitudes that are ex ante in nature and the empirical data are exposed. Yet, in order to use the theoretical analysis to interpret the empirical data, a correspondence must be established between the theoretical constructs and observed magnitudes. The second character is the transitory component. Some of the factors that give rise to transitory component of income are specific to particular consumer units. For example, illness, a bad guess about when to buy or sell and the like, and similarly chance errors of measurement. Consider a group of consumer units for the resulting transitory component to the average out, so that if they alone account for the discrepancies between the permanent and measured income, the mean measured group income would be equals to the mean permanent component and the mean transitory component would be 0. But not all factors giving rise to transitory components need to be of this kind. Some of these may be usual to the group members. For example, in case of unusual good or bad weather, if the group of farmers are located in near places or demand for a product shifts suddenly, if the group consists of consumer units whose earners are employed in producing this product, if such factors are favorable for any period, the mean transitory component is positive. If they are unfavorable, it is negative. Similarly, a systematic bias in measurement may produce a non-zero mean transitory component in recorded data, even though the transitory factors affecting the consumer units have a 0 effect on the average. On the saving front, the permanent income hypothesis generalizes the second implications of the Fisher's analysis of intertemporal interest rates. According to Friedman, to increase today's consumption, the representative household borrows when it anticipates higher income in the future. In other words, it saves less when it expects future income to be high. Conversely, the household uses the additional savings to buffer its consumption against the expected decline in income. It saves more when it expects future income to be low. Thus, like Fisher's theory of interest, Friedman's permanent income hypothesis suggests that data on savings help forecast the future income. After studying this module, you shall be able to know the concept of permanent income hypothesis, understand the difference between the permanent and transitory income, identify the shortcomings of the theory, evaluate the short run and the long run consumption function. Moving on to discuss the permanent income hypothesis. Milton Friedman PI hypothesis originates from the basic intuition that individuals would wish to smooth the consumption and not let it fluctuate with short run fluctuations in income. He tried to explain why income is more volatile than the consumption and why is the long run marginal propensity to consume out of income higher than the short run one. To answer these questions, he took that individual base their consumption on a longer term view of an income measure, perhaps a notion of lifetime wealth that is stretched over a long horizon. The basic hypothesis laid is that out of a permanent income, individuals consume only a fraction of it in each period, and thus the average propensity to consume would be equals to the marginal propensity to consume. A larger number of factors influence the propensity, such as the interest rate and taste, shifter variables, or could reflect uncertainty, etc. The parameters of Friedman's model are permanent consumption as represented by CP, permanent income represented by YP, transitory consumption represented by CT, and transitory income represented by YT. Measured income is the sum of permanent and transitory income represented by YT, and measured consumption is the sum of permanent and transitory consumption represented by CT. That is, C is equals to Cp plus Ct and Y is equals to Yp plus Yt. Permanent consumption is then determined by Cp is equals to Kyp. So, permanent consumption is a function of permanent income only where K is constant assumed. Thus, transitory component reflects genuine fluctuations or measurement error. The main point to focus on this is that the consumption level does not depend on the components that are transitory in nature. The empirical content to this hypothesis could be provided by adding the assumptions that the transitory components are uncorrelated to each other and uncorrelated to the component that is permanent. The proportion or fraction K of permanent income that is consumed depends upon the following factors. First is the rate of interest, presented by small I. Rate of interest, at a higher rate of interest, the people would tend to save more and the consumption expenditure will decrease. The lowering of rate of interest will have opposite effect on the consumption. Second, the proportion of non-human wealth to the human wealth. The relative amount of income from physical assets and income from labor also affects the consumption expenditure. This is denoted by the term W in the permanent income hypothesis. Friedman suggests that consumption expenditure depends a good deal on the wealth or assets possessed by the people to consume and vice versa. Third, desire to add to one's wealth. Lastly, the household's preferences for immediate consumption as against the desire to add to the stock of wealth or assets also determines the proportion of permanent income to be devoted to consumption. The desire to add to one's wealth rather than to fulfill one's want of immediate consumption is denoted by small u. Thus, rewriting the consumption function based on Friedman's permanent income hypothesis, we have Cp is equals to K bracket small I comma small w comma small u bracket close into Yp. The function implies that permanent consumption is a function of permanent income. The proportion of permanent income devoted to consumption depends on the rate of interest, the ratio of non-human wealth of labor income and desire to add to one's wealth. Let us now discuss the permanent and transitory income. In addition to the permanent income, the individual income may contain a transitory component that Friedman calls as transitory income. A transitory income is a temporary income that is not going to persist in future period. For example, a clerk in an office may get substantial income from the overtime work in a month which he thinks cannot be maintained. Thus, this large overtime income for a month will be transitory component of the income. According to Friedman, transitory income is not likely to have much effect on the consumption. Thus, income of an individual contains of two parts, permanent income and transitory income. Measuring the permanent income. To make the permanent income hypothesis operational, it is needed to measure permanent income. Permanent income, as is generally defined, is the steady rate if consumption a person would maintain for the rest of his or her life given the present level of wealth and income now and in future. However, it is very difficult to a person to know what part of any change in income is likely to persist and is therefore permanent, and what part would not persist and therefore transitory. Friedman had suggested a simple way of measuring the permanent income by relating it to the current and the past incomes. According to him, permanent income is equals to the last year's income plus a proportion of the change in income occurred between the last year and the current year. Thus, permanent income can be measured as Yp is equals to Yt minus 1 plus A into Yt minus Yt minus 1. This is equation 1. Yp is equals to A Yt plus 1 minus A into Yt minus 1. This is represented as equation 2. To illustrate this with an example, suppose the proportion of change in income in the last year and current year equals 0.6, and the last year's income, that is Yt minus 1, is rupees 80,000 and the current year's income Yt is rupees 85,000. Then from the equation, permanent income can be estimated as Yp is equals to 0.6 into 85,000 plus 1 minus 0.6, that is 0.4 into 80,000, which equals to 83,000. It is worthwhile to note the two features of the above equations estimating the permanent income. First, if Yt is equals to Yt minus 1, it implies that current year's income is equals to the last year's income. This further means that last year income is being maintained and therefore the individual would expect to earn the same income in the future also. In this case, then the permanent income is equal to the current or the last year's income. Secondly, when income of an individual increases in the current year as compared to the last year, the permanent income will be less than year's income. This is because the unsure of the nature of the individual about whether the increase in income will be carried in the future as well, and therefore does not immediately revise his estimate of permanent income by the full amount of the increase in his income in the current year. Next, we shall discuss the permanent income, long run and short run consumption functions. Now, it worthwhile to use the explanation of relationship between the permanent income and the permanent consumption to describe the precise relationship between consumption and income both in the short run and the long run. Consider the following. Capital C is equals to KYP is equals to KAYT plus K bracket 1 minus A bracket close Yt minus 1. In the equation, consumption function Ka is the marginal propensity to consume in the short run, which is obviously less than the long run marginal propensity to consume, which is equal to K. Thus, according to Friedman's permanent income hypothesis, in short run, marginal propensity to consume differs from the long run marginal propensity to consume, the latter being greater than the former, as 0 is less than A is less than 1. Further, K bracket 1 minus A yp is the intercept of the short run consumption function. Friedman permanent income hypothesis is illustrated in figure. It can be seen from the figure that permanent consumption function is represented by long run consumption function curve CLR, CLR is equals to KYP. This long run consumption function shows the proportional relationship between consumption and income and is as straight line passing through the origin, which implies that APC is constant and is equals to MPC. In accordance with the permanent income hypothesis, short run consumption function curves are flatter as compared to the long run consumption function curve, indicating that the short run marginal propensity to consume is lower than the long run marginal propensity to consume. The reason for this is that individual is not sure whether the increase in income will persist over the longer periods, which determines the consumption plans of an individual. Therefore, the individuals do not fully adjust their consumption expenditure according to their higher current income. The individual will fully adjust his consumption expenditure to the higher income level. It is important to note in the above analysis, it is assumed that full adjustment of current consumption expenditure to change in income takes place in 2 years' time. In this case, the permanent income is the average of the 2 years' income. However, in real world, permanent income depends on expectations of income for much longer period depending upon the vision of the individual. In case of longer vision, adjustment of consumption expenditure will take place slowly over a long period. However, if the individual is sure that the increase in income is permanent, he will adjust his consumption quickly to the higher income. It therefore follows that whereas in the short run, average propensity to consume falls as income increase, because people are not sure whether the increase in income will persist in the future or not. But when they actually find that increase in income is permanent, they fully adjust their consumption to their higher permanent income as reflected in the long run consumption function. There are some shortcomings of the theory. Let us discuss them now. The PIH, permanent income hypothesis, provides a flexible framework for the study of consumption and savings. Much of the subsequent research has filled in those elements necessary for explaining the aspect of the data, thus defining the agenda for research on the consumption and savings. Contrary to the formal versions of the model, the permanent income hypothesis as stated by Friedman did not take a very firm view on the appropriate horizon for the consumer choice. The basic hypothesis of the theory is the requirement of a rolling horizon that leads to some degree of smoothing of consumption. However, the flexibility of the hypothesis comes at a price, since it is hard to define the theoretical underpinning of the model, and consequently it is hard to make more detailed statement about the policy. The loose definition of permanent income leaves open the question of its measurement. However, the way one measures the permanent income should be a part of the model and has to do with the way individuals form expectations as well as with the stochastic process underlying the income. With liquidity constraints as taken in the model, individuals with positive assets will always behave as in the permanent income hypothesis, but individuals with zero assets may have consumption behavior such that the consumption tracks predictable changes in the income, whether transitory or not, in the presence of borrowing restrictions. Whether this will be detectable in the data depends on the proportion of individuals who are thus constrained. Let us now discuss the implications of permanent income hypothesis. The two simple premises on which the permanent income hypothesis is based are: first, that individuals wish that their expected marginal utility of consumption gets equated across time, and second, that individuals are able to make changes by saving and dissaving to a change in income. Because consumers are making their consumption decisions based on lifetime resources, the PIH implies that today's consumption will respond differently to the changes in today's income depending on whether the income changes are expected versus unexpected or temporary versus permanent. The PIH provides a sharp contrast to the Keynesian consumption rule, which assume the consumers make their consumption decisions based only on the current income. The permanent income hypothesis includes the notion of shocks to income, which may reflect real but transient or even permanent fluctuations to the income. The theoretical framework allows for uncertainty. Other implication of this theory is that the elasticity of consumption with respect to the current income should vary systematically with the degree of permanence in the changes to the household's income. In particular, the elasticity should be higher the greater is the fraction of the variation in the household income that is due to the permanent changes. The dynamic of the PIH model for an oil producer country implies that the government should use oil revenue only for the financial investments and then finance the post oil consumption by interest from these financial investments. Indeed, if one can note the implementation of low return projects in the developing countries during the oil boom periods, it is not relevant in view of their infrastructure needs to remove the physical investment from the analysis. Expected the fiscal sustainability, the adoption of the PIH does not seem to substantially improve the economics performances in the context of oil depletion, as it sacrifices the present spending for the future generations. However, as this fiscal framework favors more capital accumulation through a more contained deficit, it generates a slight better medium and long run growth. The PIH helps explain the failure of transitory Keynesian demand management techniques to achieve its policy targets. In a simple Keynesian framework, the marginal propensity to consume is assumed constant, and so the temporary tax cuts can have a large stimulating effect on demand. The permanent income hypothesis framework suggests that a consumer will spread out the gains from a temporary tax cut over a long horizon, which results in the smaller stimulus effects. Let us summarize what we have studied in this module. There are two components of the PIH theory: permanent and transitory, income and consumption. The magnitudes termed permanent income and permanent consumption that plays such a critical role in the theoretical analysis cannot be observed directly for any individual consumer unit. The second character is the transitory component. Some of the factors that give rise to transitory components of income are specific to particular consumer units. For example, illness, a bad guess about when to buy or sell, and the like, and similarly chance errors of measurement. Milton-Friedman PI hypothesis is generated from the basic intuition that individuals would wish to smooth consumption and not allow it to fluctuate with the short run fluctuations in the income. In addition to the permanent income, the individual's income may contain a transitory component that Friedman calls as transitory income. A transitory income is a temporary income that is not going to persist in the future period. In accordance with the permanent income hypothesis, short run consumption function curves are flatter as compared to the long run consumption function curves, indicating that the short run marginal propensity to consume is lower than the long run marginal propensity to consume. With liquidity constraints as taken in the model, individuals with positive assets will always behave as in the permanent income hypothesis, but individuals with zero assets may have consumption behavior such that consumption tracks predictable changes in the income, whether transitory or not, in the presence of borrowing restrictions. The two simple premises on which permanent income hypothesis is based are: first, that the individuals wish that their expected marginal utility of consumptions get equated across time, and second is that individuals are able to make changes by savings and dissavings to a change in the income.